Welcome to Taming Disaster with Drones for Good podcast, presented by Aros, part of GE Aviation, with additional financial support from First Eyes and Pix4D. Tune in for in-depth interviews, one-of-a-kind perspectives, and insightful conversations with industry leaders who are using drones to help prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex emergencies and major disasters around the world. And now, from the AIRT Studios in Miami, Florida, the heart of Hurricane Alley, here is your host, Christopher Todd.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Taming Disaster Drones for Good. Great to have you aboard. It's been a really crazy fall. That COVID pandemic, we all thought it was going to go away. Well, it hasn't gone away. It's caused a lot of shifts, but it's caused some great opportunities as well, believe it or not. With the virtual environment, we are now able to connect with people from around the world in ways that we were never really forced to do so before. And that includes live events. We've had a lot of live events lately. We've had commercial UAV Expo. We've had AUVSI's XPONENTIal, and they were both held in a virtual digital environment, which really allowed us to reach out across the oceans and go around the globe and start meeting other people who were very influential in the unmanned system space, in the emergency management and disaster relief space. And one of those is my guest here today for this show. He is the National Director of Disaster Relief Teams for Disaster Relief Australia, Richard Adams. Welcome to the program. Great to have you aboard, Richard.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I know it's other side of the world, so we're about 12, 14 hours apart. You're in New Zealand right now, right?
I am, yes.
Is this a vacation or work?
No, so I've moved home for a while. While I'm with Disaster Relief Australia, I was born and raised in New Zealand, and New Zealand's having a slightly better time of it with COVID at the moment. So I'm back for a little while.
Okay. Oh, you mean right now New Zealand's having a hard time with COVID?
No. So at the moment we've got 0 community cases.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I mean, it's like everyone says New Zealand is the place to get away from this. So yeah, good move on your part.
Yeah, it's been a bit bizarre coming from. I was in Melbourne, which has been under some form of lockdown since March. So coming from that to what feels like relative freedom it's been a bit of a change.
And I'm going to do a major sidetrack here, and I apologize to all the listeners because, yeah, we are going to talk about drones and unmanned systems and disasters. But when I've got a New Zealander on, I've got to ask, is it rugby season?
It is, Chris. So actually tomorrow night, so Saturday night, is the first international game since last year. Obviously, COVID's put a stop to international games, but we play the old enemy Australia tomorrow night for what's called the Bledisloe Cup, which Australia hasn't held since about 2002. So we're hoping that that continues for a number of years. Big
rivalry. There'll be I know the All Blacks do that dance when they come out, which is intimidating. So all right, well, now back to the reason we're here, and that is taming disaster, talking about the use of drones for good and for disaster relief. I know you've got a fascinating story. I heard you speak at XPONENTIal, and I've got some of your background, but for the listeners out there that didn't get a chance to connect with you at XPONENTIal, tell us a little bit about how you got first involved with unmanned aircraft systems and drones and started using this technology.
Yeah, sure. So it all started for me, 10 years ago this year, which doesn't feel like very long, but in the scheme of things, when it comes to drones feels like quite a long time. While I've been working in Australia and I'm from New Zealand, I actually joined the British Army, so I'm a dual citizen between New Zealand and the UK. I joined 11 or so years ago, and I ended up in a unit that operated many unmanned aero systems, so sort of hand-launched unmanned systems. And I spent a year with that unit before then deploying to Helmand Province in southern Afghanistan. And I was the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance officer for a unit that was known as the Brigade Reconnaissance Force. So the main idea being to gather as much intelligence as possible from throughout the area of operations. And a lot of that was done through the use of unmanned systems or drones. So over the course of that deployment, I was able to exercise just over 1,000 hours of command and control of unmanned systems, from everything from your small hand-launched platforms through to your Predator and Reaper platforms as well. So it was a bit of I suppose, baptism of fire, so to speak, when it came to the use of drones. But it was a fantastic experience, sort of setting up for everything from there. After that, I managed unmanned system training for the Army in Germany and Canada. The British Army had training grounds in those countries, and I managed the unmanned systems training aspect of that. And I ended my time in the Army writing regulations for the use of small unmanned systems in British airspace. So trying to expand the amount of airspace we had to play with for training in the UK. So as I say, it was a fantastic base.
So that is such a unique start for, I mean, most of the guests we've had on the program so far coming out of public safety or emergency management, and to be in that environment in Afghanistan and using these systems is something I want to delve a little bit deeper into. I know you said you were using all different categories and classes. Were you using primarily like fixed wings? Were you using VTOL, rotorcraft? What was kind of your fleet looking like over there?
The vast majority were fixed wing. So
okay.
Our internal platforms were what was called the Desert Hawk 3, which is a Lockheed Martin platform, sort of a small 2-meter hand-launched fixed-wing observation aircraft. We had large sort of 9-meter wingspan aircraft that we operated internally as well that would take off from Camp Bastion, which was the main base in our area of operations, and be flown from shipping containers there, and then through to, as I say, larger fixed-wing aircraft such as Predator and Reaper that were flown by crews based out of Nevada, which was slightly surreal. We had one VTOL platform, which was the Tarantula Hawk, which was used primarily for searching for IEDs, for improvised explosive devices.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know the U.S. Air Force uses Creech Air Force Base in Nevada for command and control on a lot of the larger aircraft. But I mean, I've never been to Afghanistan. I think like most people, we've seen representations of the country either on the news or in cinema. And one thing that really sticks out is these tall, towering, steep valleys, mountains. Not the kind of a area that I would, look to be using unmanned systems for me personally, especially fixed wing. I'm used to this sea level operations in Florida. I'm a little spoiled that way. So it's a whole new skill set to be able to go into that type of environment and fly in those areas. I mean, what was that like? How did you train for that?
So the area of Helmand Province that we were in was relatively flat. So it was mostly sort of desert, apart from the Helmand River and called the Arghandab River Valley. So they were challenging. But it wasn't, it certainly wasn't mountainous terrain like you'd find in other parts of the country, which made it easier, especially when it came to communications with unmanned systems in terms of line of sight communications and video feeds and command and control and things like that. The challenge was that when you've got a desert, everything looks pretty similar. So it's about narrowing down what you want to be looking at and when.
Okay, so now I'm breathing a little easier, because now I get all the problems and all the issues of flying through those mountain valleys were running through my mind. But now, all right, now we're in a desert. I get it. So what was the typical mission you guys would do? I mean, was it scouting, recon? Was it force protection? What was there a typical mission, or what were some of the things you would use the systems for?
Yeah, each mission varied in some way. There were some sort of standard template missions. So the unit I was with, without going off on too much of a tangent, it was obviously a counterinsurgency environment. So a lot of ground units would go into a certain location that would stay there for 6 months. They'd try and get the local population on side and deal with the insurgent groups that were in the area. We were an operations unit, so we were centrally based, and we would go out to various places as and when required, whether to do reconnaissance, whether to deal with a threat, whether to bust identified drug or explosive hordes, stuff like that. So a lot of times we'd be arriving in an area where other troops hadn't been. So one of the less dynamic tasks, I suppose, was what we call a pattern of life soak. So we'd have a fixed wing platform that would essentially sit over a village or a location for sometimes a couple of days. The change of aircraft every 12, 14 hours whenever they needed to. And we'd have people who would just sit there and look at a village, see what the comings and goings were like, what the activity was around the area we'd be arriving in, just so we knew what we were getting ourselves into before we arrived. And then once troops did arrive on the ground, it was very much about force protection. So identifying a number of things. It could be something as overt as someone running around with a weapon, or someone who was just paying a little bit too much attention to what we're up to, who was then feeding information off to other people, through to things like people digging in IEDs, or indicators that something was about to happen. So, for example, if all the local population suddenly packed up, jumped on a tractor and trailer and left the area, it was a fairly good indicator that something was going to happen.
Yeah, that's a red flag.
It certainly was, yep. So, and for a lot of the time, especially working in villages where there were high-walled compounds, the troops on the ground wouldn't be able to see that. Whereas obviously having a unmanned system circling above, we're able to identify that really, really easily.
Yeah, that had to be a game changer. We hear a lot about the strategy in Afghanistan of winning the hearts and minds of, and like you said, ingratiating yourself into the different tribes and clans and the local population. Did you use unmanned systems in that capacity at all, or was it strictly just for military purposes?
Yeah, a little bit. Like I said, in terms of the pattern of life, so having an understanding of how a village, for example, how it operated before we arrived. So when we arrived, we were able to have a better idea of how we were able to then, at a base level, communicate with the people in that village. It was also useful for being able to track individuals of interest, primarily people who were up to no good, so to speak.
Yep.
So we were then able to isolate those people when we were going to go in and meet with the local elders, have a shura, so a sit-down meeting, so that we knew who to talk to and who not to talk to.
Yep. And obviously we've all seen the large drones on the UAVs, the Reapers, the Global Hawks. What was it like? I mean, did the local villagers ever see you using these unmanned systems? Like, what was their reaction to seeing some of these smaller UAVs, if that ever happened?
Yeah, so platforms like Predator, Reaper, they weren't too bad for the most part. They were covert, so you wouldn't know they were there.
Sure. Yeah.
Some of our other aircraft, so our sort of medium altitude, long endurance platforms that sat around 14,000 feet, you could hear them most of the time. And the hand-launched ones, if they were low enough, you'd also hear them. So there were two aspects to that. One was if we wanted to be covert, as in make sure they didn't know they were there. There are ways of doing that. So, downwind, for example. So the wind would carry away the noise of the engine, so they would know that. On the other hand, they were also useful for certain operations where if they're up and flying around, those on the ground would know they were there. So they wouldn't do anything until those aircraft left. So we had other ways that we could undertake reconnaissance of an area. So we'd have an aircraft flying around and then it would disappear. And then everyone would sort of come out and do their thing, but we'd still have ways of looking in as to what was happening. So there were ways to make the most of that.
Understood. So that's pretty fascinating because I know everybody knows about the large drones. We see them in movies all the time, but to really learn how they're used tactically at the troop level is pretty unique, and it's I think it lends some insight. And there's so much opportunity that I think transcends the military side that we're now seeing in commercial development and public safety and search and rescue. And that kind of brings me to my next question. So you were in the Army for how long? About 10 years?
No, in the end, about 7 years in total.
Okay, about 7 years, and then it's time to separate. And what then? What was going through your mind? I mean, obviously you had an affinity for these systems. So what was the path forward for Richard Adams at that point?
Yeah, so when I left the Army, I was sort of working on the assumption that I wouldn't get a chance to work with unmanned systems again. I thought I was very lucky to have done to get the chance to do what I did. I didn't see an obvious way of continuing to do that. I didn't feel like I had quite enough experience to go into the commercial side. So I almost put it on the back burner. And when I left the Army, I relocated to Melbourne. So, I finished with the Army on the Friday, flew out on the Sunday. And I didn't really have an employment plan, so to speak, when I arrived in Melbourne. So it was about job hunting. But as you and your listeners would be very aware, Australia is rather prone to bushfires and to wildfires.
Oh yeah,
they're much like parts of the US.
Like California right now is
exactly
largely having that problem.
Yeah, exactly that. And once I arrived in Australia, I sort of realised how big the emergency management sector was. That's where I focused my efforts in terms of employment. And I ended up working for the Victorian state government, so Melbourne being in the state of Victoria, in what was the Fire and Emergency Management Division. And initially that was around managing a workforce rather than any sort of capability. But sort of slowly over time, I basically got dragged back into the unmanned systems world, sometimes on purpose, sometimes on accident. So I spent a lot of time working with the manned aviation community. So I spent a bit of time managing what's called the Aviation Services Unit, which manages all emergency aviation in Victoria. So I got a perspective of the manned aviation aspect. And as with a lot of emergency services or emergency departments around that time, and up until recently, everyone was very excited about the idea of drones. And so slowly they came to the fore again. I ended up being involved in a number of sort of trial projects. And after being in that role for a couple of years, I ended up moving across to Parks Victoria, which is the Victorian version of the US Forest Service. And they were really keen to launch their own drone program, and I ended up becoming their first chief remote pilot as part of my role there. So it took a couple of years, but I got fully immersed in the unmanned systems world again.
Wow, that's a lot. So you basically got fully immersed in unmanned systems, emergency management. Did you have any emergency management background, or the military service just kind of transcended into that sector?
No, I had no direct experience, but the principles are more or less the same. So it's operationally focused in a high environment.
A lot of logistics, a lot of coordination, operations, and command structure.
Exactly that. Yeah. So uniforms are different, tasks are different, but the foundations are the same.
Awesome. So what kind of aircraft was the Park Service using when you went over there? I mean, did they have larger aircraft or small or?
No, so it was all small quadcopter type platforms, which was sort of the plan that there was a number of trials that took place where a significant amount of money was spent on very large sort of fixed wing platforms, for example, where the government departments undertaking the trials had no organic unmanned systems knowledge. So it's like learning to fly on an A380. It's not how it should be done. You need to start small and build it up, which is why those trials never went anywhere, because there wasn't the internal knowledge to take them forward. Whereas Parks Victoria went down a different route, which was to start simple, which in my mind was very much the right thing to do. So it was a fleet of a number of different kind of rotary wing platforms used for a combination of land management and emergency management purposes.
So we're seeing so many great use cases kind of come out of Australia. In fact, even at Exponential last week, we had Carl Cutler from the Queensland Police Department showcasing a motorcycle they've taken that they've turned into a traffic investigation unit, which was really cool. I know some of the cops here in the U.S. were like, "Whoa, we need to do that." You could see them talking about it in the chat. We've also seen like some really strong use cases with swimmer safety and like shark patrols and things like that. To your mind, like what really stands out in Australia and how these systems are being used for good ways?
Yeah, I had the fortune to be able to have a close up look at that the police motorcycle rig last year. It's quite impressive, and I was very envious. Hopefully they'll do a civilian version. I might think about purchasing one. Yeah, you're right. So the life-saving teams primarily in New South Wales have done some fantastic work in terms of public safety, so searching for those in trouble in the water and also identifying sharks. The biggest risk in Australia is wildfires or bushfires. So there's been a number of different examples of where unmanned systems have been used in that environment, primarily in the post-fire operational environment, mainly because there is a significant manned aviation fleet in Australia to deal with wildfires. So in Victoria, in a normal summer, there's 52 aircraft based in Victoria that are based solely there to undertake wildfire work. So it does get very, very complicated in terms of, particularly in terms of airspace. So the biggest opportunity has sat with that post-fire environment. So being able to go in and undertake damage assessments that normally don't actually happen, even with those manned aviation assets available, because they're off fighting the next fire as opposed to looking at the one that happened yesterday.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing out in the Western U.S. right now. We all see the stories. It's every time there's a fire, it seems there's a drone incursion that at some point causes the water drops to be halted until the drone's out of the incident scene, and then the media is running with that story. So I think there's an educational process that's going on to kind of educate pilots. Don't be a bonehead. But we're also seeing these new use cases come up where drones are being used to kind of chart out fire lines and map the probability and help develop preparedness surrounding potential firefighting before fires happen, especially in very dry conditions. And definitely, to your point on the damage assessment, a good friend of mine, Dr. Greg Krustinger with GeoAcuity, has been mapping fires now for a couple of years out there, and he's working right now conducting damage assessment with public safety teams out there on the areas the fires go through. So it seems like the workflow is starting to kind of fall into place into a workflow where unmanned systems, the smalls, are being used, before a fire happens. Then you've got a fire. The drones kind of clear out, and the manned aviators come in for the water drops. And then as that fire moves, the manned aviators move with the fire, and then the drones can come back in and start conducting damage assessment on the areas that have been burned out, especially those residential areas and things like that. Are you seeing that same kind of pattern develop in Australia?
Yeah, so it's taken a little while to get away from the traditional model, which is to send up a drone with a camera and watch a fire burn. That's the way it's been done for a couple of years, and I understand that. And that's in some cases that's excellent because it provides intelligence on fire spread that you might not otherwise have. But absolutely, there are use cases before, during, and after, and we're certainly seeing more in the before and after aspects, so preparedness and recovery. So even somewhere as large as Australia, one that we've been looking at is the idea of being able to observe certain areas of sort of high risk forest for things like lightning strikes. So the majority of fires, I think they're doing in the US, majority of wildfires here start because of dry lightning. So being able to identify exactly where that lightning is striking and where the ignition point is for that fire, is potentially going to save millions of acres of forest and plenty of property and life as well. So being able to have those platforms flying around would be really useful. But it's also things like checking on work that's already been done. So we do a lot of non-burn vegetation management in Australia, so creating fire breaks through forests. So being able to map those, make sure they're the right width to be able to withstand a fire as best they can coming through. And using that to model fire behavior, which is information you wouldn't have otherwise.
So are you working with GIS pros and data management personnel to take that data off the aircraft and develop those types of data products with intelligence? Or are you guys doing that yourself?
Yeah, so one thing we've been really, really big on, and for me it's been something that was sort of hammered into me when I was in the military, was it's not about the aircraft, it's about the product. So the biggest, fanciest, most expensive aircraft, but if you don't get a usable product out of it, it's not really worth the effort. And we're very much focused on that. So within Disaster Relief Australia, we have what we call our aerial damage assessment team, or our ADAT, because everyone in the military and the emergency services loves a good acronym that would come up
Yep.
with it. And there's two aspects to the ADAT. One is having certified drone operators doing the flying out in the field, and the other is having a team of image analysts to then assess that data. So again, it's all well and good having that information, but without processing it and turning it into intelligence, it's not really worth it. And it was a bit of a lesson for us in 2018. I was fortunate enough to take a team to Indonesia after the earthquake and tsunami there, and there was only a small team. There was only 4 of us, and we were doing the flying, but we're also doing the analysis of the imagery as well, of the data. And there was we did 1,400 hectares. I'm not sure what that is in acres, probably 2,000 plus acres, I would have thought. And analysing that much data took a long time. So we'd spend all day flying, then all night doing the analysis, which wasn't ideal.
Not fun.
No. Yeah. And, fatigue was then obviously an issue when it came to flying. So we've developed a system where we have those operating in the field, and then those back of house who will then analyse the imagery and then provide a product, whether it's to our own teams, whether it's to members of the community, whether it's to emergency management agencies, with useful, workable data that they can then make the most of.
And how are you transmitting the data from the field out to end users in the emergency operations center or command and control? I mean, are you using like mobile connectivity? You have satellite uplinks. How do you get those products into the right hands?
Yeah, it depends on the scenario. So a lot of times, in Australia especially, we're fortunate enough to be working, if not in an area with good Wi-Fi access, then not too far away from it. So, a team will go out, do some flying, do some mapping flights, for example. They'll then be able to come back, upload that imagery, it'll process, and then our image analysts will download it, do the work from the comfort of their home, and then get it to whoever needs it. Occasionally, that's not the case, so we've relied on satellite comms for that, which is a slightly slower and certainly more expensive way of doing it. But fortunately, that's in the minority of cases.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think mobile connectivity is the go-to for everyone when we do have it. Here in the States, when we get a hurricane coming through and sometimes knocks out cuts the fiber or knocks out those tower systems, then it's on to plan B and we're scrambling. But, get to your point, getting the data where it needs to go is really what all this is about, at least now, while we're in this era of imagery collection and imagery analysis. I mean, as we start getting into cargo transportation and potentially hauling disaster relief supplies, the whole game's going to potentially change and evolve into a whole new discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. And the speed of that transfer of data and intelligence is key. So it was a lesson for me. The last few years, as part of my role over summer, I've sat in the back of a helicopter that's got a FLIR camera on the front and go around doing fire spotting. So I've sort of been fortunate to cross within the manned aviation community as well as the unmanned community. And one of the issues there was you had a very expensive helicopter with a very expensive camera on the front of it. And the information, there's always a bit of an issue getting the information from the helicopter through the incident control center, then out to those on the fire line who might need it. So it wasn't unusual for that information to get to them, well after they needed it or well after the situation had changed. So a fire front maybe one day, it's a very different place the next day. Same with hotspots if they're looking at dealing with hotspots. So that's been a focus for us, making sure we can get that information to the people who need it within a time frame where it's still useful. Because otherwise, what's the point? It's just sort of a pretty data pack as opposed to something workable. Yep.
Now, from a regulatory perspective, here in the U.S., we have FAA Part 107 that basically everyone is following. If you're doing any type of commercial operation, only a hobbyist would really be authorized to fly. Non-Part 107, and then but if you're doing public safety disaster response, you should be Part 107. What is the equivalent to that in Australia?
Yeah, so in Australia, we've got the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, and they have Part 101, which covers unmanned systems. There's two different aspects to unmanned systems. There's your hobbyist who they don't need any sort of formal qualification or certification, and then you've got anyone who's operating for profit or reward. So anytime when their imagery or data is more than just a pretty picture on Instagram, they then need to have what's called a remote aircraft operator certificate, or a REOC, which is an organizational certificate. So very much like a certificate that an airline would have to operate. Obviously slightly more simple than an airline one, but it's still a process you have to go through. So you need sort of a library of procedures and a manual as to how you operate. And then everyone within the organization or within the team who's actually doing the flying then needs a remote pilot's license, which is a typically sort of 4 to 5 day course that covers everything from weather to aerodynamics to radio communications, and of course sort of manual operation of unmanned systems as well. And that's if you want to go and do, say, real estate photography, you'd need that. There are some exclusions. If you're only operating Phantoms, it's slightly, or something small, or Mavics, it's slightly less. But yeah, if you want to operate anything decent, that's what you need to do. And then if you want to do anything that is sort of beyond a standard operation, so probably similar to what you have in the US, where beyond, above 400 feet, beyond line of sight, over populated areas, within 3 miles of an airport, you need specific approvals from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to be able to do that. So you have to submit a safety case to say, what you're doing, when, and how it's going to be done safely. And obviously that's an interesting aspect when it comes to emergency response work. A lot of the time, you don't know what's coming, you don't know where it's going to be. So for us, it's been a bit of a challenge, a good challenge to find how we can operate within the standard limitations within that environment. Without breaking the law or upsetting those who are already operating there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's so many parallels between the Australian Civil Aviation UAS platform and here the FAA Part 107. And to your point, I mean, getting airspace authorization, especially in an area where some events are predictable, like hurricanes. We kind of know when they're going to strike and roughly where they're going to strike, but tornadoes, earthquakes can just kind of pop up. And to be able to get that airspace authorization, we here work with what's called the FAA's System Operations Security Group, SOSG, which is the group that handles everything from presidential VIP TFRs to an SGI, or strategic government interest authorization for a small public safety agency. Is there a group in Australia that's similar that would handle something like that you guys work with?
Not really. Certainly not that we work with. So for us in an emergency, it's for any operator who wants to come and fly in an emergency situation, you'll have within the AIM structure, so the Australasian Inter-Service Incident Management System. So I think MCCS is the equivalent in the US, MTIS. There'll be an incident controller for that incident, whether it's a million-acre fire or a house fire or a tornado or what have you. And for us, both for the aerodam assessment team with Disaster Relief Australia, or for any of the work we do, because that's only one small part of our overall team, we don't operate at all unless we have approval from the incident controller to do so. So, when it comes to airspace as well, there'll be an aircraft officer who'll work with the incident controller to say, right, you can fly in this area, you can't fly in this area if it's an active response. On top of that, there's large areas of Australia that are covered by, as I'm sure there are in the US, covered by military airspace.
Yep.
So you have to get approval from the airspace manager, so the local squadron airspace manager. So there's always a number of boxes we have to tick in order to then fly. So it often means that we don't fly in a response scenario, again, because there's often a large number of manned aviation assets already there. So the need isn't as large, but it's as soon as they sort of depart, but it's still an active event, but we need to be able to fly. So there's a number of different organizations or people that we need to talk to allow that to happen.
So you guys call it the incident controller. We've got the incident command system, ICS here, and we call it incident commander, but it sounds like it's pretty much the same system with slightly nuanced different titles.
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Gotcha.
Pretty much exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk about Disaster Relief Australia in more detail. I mean, we kind of left off the story. You were with Victoria Park Service. How did you get to Disaster Relief Australia? Tell me about the organization. What does it do? What do you do there? We want to hear as much as we can in the next 5 or so minutes.
Sure. I'll see what I can squeeze in.
All right.
So Disaster Relief Australia is sort of the latest iteration of what was originally Team Rubicon in the US, and a number of your listeners are probably familiar with the name. So Team Rubicon started in 2010 following the Haitian earthquake. So a small group of US military veterans traveled across. They were mainly medical personnel, traveled across to see how they could help. And from that, Team Rubicon was born. Over time, various different countries started their own Team Rubicon. So Team Rubicon Canada, Norway, UK, and Australia back in 2016. And then earlier this year, we rebranded from Team Rubicon Australia to Disaster Relief Australia, just to give us a bit more of a local feel. So it went from having a sort of a brown and red diamond as a symbol to a white and blue kangaroo, which resonates with the locals a little bit more.
Sure, I bet it does.
It certainly does, yep. And my involvement with, I'll go back a step. The whole point of the organisation is to take military and emergency services veterans and deploy them as volunteer teams in the wake of natural disasters. And there's two sides to that. One is we're making the most of an existing skill set that's often underutilized for people once they leave the services, whether they're military service or emergency services. But it's also providing a sense of purpose, community, and identity to people who have got out of the services and might be feeling a little bit lost, for want of a better term. You know, that camaraderie that exists in both the military and the emergency services or first responders. You know, people leave those organisations and they can't really find that in the civilian world. So it's sort of what we serve as an outlet for that. And the saying that sort of gets brought up is that if you want to help a veteran, you ask them to help somebody else, because the sense of of well-being that comes from helping somebody on what is potentially their worst day following a disaster is immeasurable. So it's unusual in a disaster relief organisation, and yet it does have that dual aspect of helping those who have been impacted, but also helping those who are doing the helping. My involvement started back in 2017, where I joined the Melbourne disaster relief team as a volunteer. And I've been a volunteer. I was a volunteer up until February this year. But then early in 2018, again, given my background and being aware that what was then Team Rubicon Australia wanted to start a drone program, I sort of put my hand up for that. So yeah, that was founded in May 2018, and then our first operation was in October 2018, and the one I mentioned earlier to Indonesia following the earthquake and tsunami there. Generally speaking, Disaster Relief Australia, we've got just under 3,000 registered members across the country and 6 formal teams spread across various cities, and we'll be adding to those teams over the next couple of years.
Wow. And what does your UAS fleet look like?
It's modest, which is no surprise given that we're a charity organisation. So it's a combination of rotary and fixed wing, primarily mapping platforms. So your DJI variants up to Matrice 210s, and then EVs for our fixed wing fleet. But it's certainly growing over time as we attract more support, especially from the industry.
Now, when the organization was Team Rubicon Australia, from my understanding, Team Rubicon here in the States does not operate drones. Maybe that's changed, but last I checked, they did not. So it's kind of cool that you guys said, hey, we're going to use them over in Australia. Was that an issue at all within the organization, or not so much?
No, that certainly wasn't an issue. Team Rubicon USA has a lot of capabilities that we don't have in Australia, and vice versa. So it's just about identifying the skill sets that exist within the organizations and making the most of them.
Gotcha. And are you partnering now with other NGOs and nonprofits for disaster response, or what does your operation typically look like if you're going out to do a response effort?
Yeah, each one is slightly different. So we primarily partner with emergency management agencies. So at the moment, we're not for the most part, we're not considered a formal emergency management agency, but that's sort of changing over time as we undertake more operations and become more ingrained in sort of standard day-to-day operations in that space, because what we provide overall is there's a gap in the existing structure. So we show up post-response, so the start of that recovery, where there isn't a lot of whether it's federal or state funding dedicated to that at the moment in terms of agencies. So, if someone's had a fire rip through their property and they've got trees down across their driveway, their house is burnt down, that initial assistance often doesn't come for some time, often months. So where we operate is that space of immediately post-response, but before that long-term recovery. So going through and helping people, clear their properties, clear debris, search for valuables and buildings, just to ease that process for them slightly. So a lot of the traditional emergency management agencies recognise that we do fill that gap. So we're starting to become more part of that formal arrangement. So our main partnering on operations is with, whether it's with Emergency Management Victoria or the New South Wales Rural Fire Service or whoever it might be that's operating in the area. We also partner with other charities and organisations who are doing similar work. We understand that, we're not the only ones doing this, and it's not a competition. It's all about doing the best we can for those who are impacted. So we've been working with the Minderoo Foundation, for example, for a while, who provide significant assistance to those impacted by disasters. And there are localised agreements as well. So with more localised charities that we work with. So the Return Services League, which I think is very much like your Veterans of Foreign Wars, I want to call it. The
VFW.
Similar sort of organisation, and they're really big supporters of what we do, whether it's providing us with meals while we're deployed, or financial support, or just places where we can meet and undertake training, so things like that. So we have a number of different arrangements and agreements in place.
That's great. That's amazing. And what you really said, having the veterans out there helping others actually helps them, I think, is the most amazing part of this conversation, because I don't think people, everyone's kind of heard of Team Rubicon, at least here in the US, but they don't really think about it from that perspective. And that's powerful.
It is. And there's different levels of it too. So, we might have someone who just comes out for a week and lifts debris from a house and clears that and does that for a week, sort of essentially what you consider unskilled labor. And that's great. We need that. Through to something like our aerial damage assessment team, where we have highly skilled individuals undertaking sort of high value work at the same time. So that sense of giving back, regardless of, again, whether they're just doing manual labor or operating fixed wing drones, it's very much the same.
So, Richard, as we start to wind this down, any final thoughts from your perspective? Anything you want to leave the audience with?
From an unmanned systems perspective, I suppose from my point of view, and I mentioned it earlier, where people get very excited by the tech. Chris, you and I are both drone enthusiasts. Most people listening to this podcast are drone enthusiasts, and one of the issues is that if you're an enthusiast, you often end up talking about the equipment and how exciting it is and what it can do, which is fine. But especially when it comes to emergency management, whether it's before, during, or after an event, those who are actually on the front line, so to speak, or the communities who are impacted, they don't care about the tech. They don't care how the resolution of your camera or how long you can fly for. Now that's great, but they don't care. What they care about is what you can provide them. What is the product? How is the data that you provide going to assist them in their preparedness, response, or recovery? And I think as a community, we sometimes lose that fact, and that doesn't do us any favors when we're trying to integrate with more traditional agencies, or whether it's with manned aviation. So I think we need to, as a community, work on our sales pitch in terms of what we can provide rather than what it is we're playing with, so to speak.
I couldn't have said that better myself. For people who want more information on Disaster Relief Australia, your URL, I believe, is disasterreliefaus.org. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
All right, disasterreliefaus.org. Richard Adams, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Taming Disaster Drones for Good. I hope you will come back and join us again we've got to talk more down the road.
Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in to episode 10 of Taming Disaster, Drones for Good. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Taming Disaster, a production of AIRT, the world's leading nonprofit organization supporting drones for good. Learn more about us online at airt.ngo. And be sure to tune in to our public safety focused podcast, Drone Responders, hosted by Charles Werner.